How much of your ambition is built on trying to be forgiven? That is the question that we're going to try to break down today. And it's easy to think that we are born pure and that somehow the world corrupts us as we grow up. The problem isn't with me, it's with them, whoever them refers to. But what I'd like to challenge in this lesson is that it's not you or them that's wrong, but it's the way that the whole problem is set up to begin with. It's this overly romantic view of the past which needs to be looked at and to be challenged. So I'm going to spell out the problem first. I'm going to offer a solution second, based on the wonderful Ken Wilber, a little bit more on him later on, and also make it clear why feelings of frustration and anxiety and overwhelm and guilt or any other heavy or difficult experiences are actually signs that you're on the right path. So let's get started with a really simple 3-part diagram just to spell all this out to begin with. So the overly romantic view of the past or childhood is that we start out in a state of unconscious heaven. So in a perfect world and in an ideal childhood, everything is amazing because we are completely cared for. It's a state of bliss where we're looked after completely and all of our needs are attended to. It's a state of paradise. There's nothing expected of us. So we don't need a job, we don't have bills to pay. The outside world doesn't seem like a threat at all. There's no blame, and as a result, we don't need forgiveness because it's a paradise, like the Garden of Eden. But just like in the biblical story, there is a fall from grace. And Adam and Eve, they become self-conscious and they become more and more aware of themselves. And they start to feel embarrassment and guilt about their actions and who they are. And once they've woken up from their unconscious state, they can never really go back. That's what the biblical story tells us. They're removed from the Garden of Eden and they become isolated from God's paradise. It's what's referred to as the fall of man. So they go from an unconscious heaven to a conscious hell. And away from the religious story, the romantic view of our upbringing, it follows very similar themes. So we break away from the safety of our mother, and what happens is we start to feel a little bit more vulnerable. So we start to become a little bit more aware of ourselves as these little vulnerable humans, just like Adam and Eve broke away from the safety of the garden. And we start to feel scared and we start to experience tragedies and we become isolated. And as a result of all this, we start to suppress and repress any overwhelming thoughts and emotions. And it's in the romantic myth where we essentially realize this and then we make this really swift U-turn to end up going back to our earlier state. Our ambition, it gets muddled up with us trying to desperately seek forgiveness. So we just abandon that ambition and we focus squarely on the forgiveness aspect instead. So for the romantic, the road ends up leading to a state of unconscious heaven. So we've got this little 3-step system of going from unconscious heaven to conscious hell to conscious heaven. But there is a big problem in something like this. So this assumes that we started out in connection with God and then we lost our connection. So the next step then would be a regression back into this complete union with God, except this time we just do it consciously. So it's one where we become nostalgic for a time where we hadn't separated ourselves from the outside world. And if you want to use non-religious language, then this assumes that we know who we are, so that's our true self. Then we lose connection with it because of the difficulties that we face in the world. And then we regress basically back into a childhood version of ourselves and become our true self again. But what's to say that I was more me at age 5 compared to 35? I've had more life experiences and I can make more choices at 35 compared to 5. And this sets up this really nice little interesting philosophical problem on the side of what age are you more you? 5? 25? 45? 65? 85? The romantic view, it would suggest that it's this 5-year-old version of you, if not an even younger version still. The assumption is that we remember living in paradise before the fall. That I will remember and I will become more me if I forget who I am and my ambitions and I focus on this regression and I focus on forgiveness instead. to go back to what I had, but what I lost. So let's challenge all of that. So what we need to do, we need to think about it as, and this is what Ken Wilber's argument is going to be, is that steps 2 and 3, they're absolutely fine. The issue is with step 1. So we weren't actually in an unconscious heaven at all. It was actually an unconscious hell. So what we need to try to think about here is we need to think about it as we were completely vulnerable and we were open to threats basically from all angles, but the problem is that we weren't aware of it. That's where the unconscious part comes in. There wasn't really an I or a me to be self-conscious about. There was just the raw experience of the world. So from a first-person perspective, it wasn't so much about purity and blamelessness as it was just not having an ego awareness which could reflect on anything whatsoever. So we weren't in unconscious heaven at all. We just didn't realize we were in hell already. So step 2 in this diagram is realizing that as you mature, you become more aware of yourself as separate from just this raw experience. And from your mother specifically, which is especially important if you're a man watching this. More on that another time. And you start to begin to develop your own ego. So you develop your own ambitions and your plans for who you want to become. An ego, in this sense, is not a dirty word at all. It's just a part of the process. You become a person and you differentiate yourself from others. And by definition, that is isolating. And that is a good thing and a bad thing. So you mature and you become aware of who you are. And a part of that is realizing that you weren't born in this unconscious paradise at all. You weren't born in perfect union with God only to be kicked out by God's grace because of something that you've done with the aim of trying to return. There was never any separation to begin with. You were always connected and in union with God, but just not in the way that you expected. So in non-religious terms, you were already and you've always been in contact with this higher power or this higher self. There just wasn't always a clear realization of that fact. So we need to become a person first and then look to solve the specific problems that are relevant for us that are stopping our evolution, which goes forwards. So we're trying to solve those problems that are blocking our ambitions rather than seeking forgiveness for something that we've not even done in the first place. And that's going to look different for each of us. And it's a journey from unconscious awareness of ourselves to becoming self-conscious to becoming super conscious. So another way of saying all this, if I just use a separate little note on here, we're going to be evolving from the pre-personal to the personal to the transpersonal states. So I'm going from not even being aware that I exist as a young baby, which is pre-personal, to realizing in childhood that I am a real person and seeing how I shape myself and how the outside world shapes me. So that's personal. And then maturing to see how I can take control of this evolution. That'd be transpersonal. So our personal growth, it's not this U-turn about going back into childhood and taking up this false sense of innocence where the focus is going to be on forgiveness. That's just a big misunderstanding on what growth means. It's more of starting here and going on an upward spiral, which is going to be constantly spiraling upwards. So let me just move some of these out of the way so I can make that a little bit clearer, because I realize it's not directly obvious. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to integrate these learnings on the way. I realize my heights as well as my depths as I spiral around and I move towards my ambitions. The goal isn't to dissolve my understanding of myself and to regress back into childhood. It's an attempt to awaken through it, to grow through it, to become more me and not less me. I want more consciousness, not less. So a higher quality consciousness rather than some messy confusion where I don't really know where I begin and end and where the world begins or ends. That'd be like living in a dream state, which is going to be very, very destabilizing. So it's a tricky sentence to read, but I really do love how Ken Wilber words something like this when he says, development is not regression in service of ego, but evolution in transcendence of ego. That's the sentence that I've been trying to break down in my mind as I've been going through this lesson, because I appreciate it's quite a subtle and quite a fine point. It's quite a technical point. So bringing it back full circle, like I said earlier on, difficult feelings and experiences, they aren't necessarily signs that something has gone wrong on this journey. So if we take anxiety, for example, if we're in our 20s and we're feeling anxious, it doesn't make sense to overly romanticize and be overly nostalgic for a non-anxious time in our early childhoods. It wasn't that there was no anxiety, it's that there wasn't a first-person awareness of what it was to even be anxious. And if you did feel anxious, because we were so vulnerable and that feeling was so overwhelming, then we would just turn to a parent or someone in authority to protect us. It was too much to realize just how open we were to the threats of the world. And on a practical level, if you're currently feeling anxious right now as you're watching this, then it might be more worthwhile to start to move towards acceptance of the feeling and try to make a little bit of room for it. So, where possible, not to wish it away, but to try to lean into it. So, a couple of questions just to help you out on that journey. What is it trying to reveal to you about yourself? And what is it trying to reveal about your current life situation? And what do you need to be able to manage and deal with this anxiety? And how can you go about solving this problem? Because by answering questions like this, we're not avoiding anxiety and regressing backwards. We're using and we're moving through anxiety to reach a more worthwhile conclusion. We're moving away from seeking forgiveness and instead towards this healthy sense of ambition. We need to realize that we're not just a static and a fixed person, but instead we are an evolving person. And we need to mature, and as we mature even, we learn that we're not just this anxious feeling. We're not even just a little bit more than this anxious feeling, but we're so much more than it. And that's why I really like these terms. So when I was saying before, like transpersonal and this idea of transcendence of ego, it's by realizing our true heights that we're going to be able to deal with our true depths and those experiences of those true depths. So we end up in conscious heaven when we realize that we have agency and we can correct our problems and our difficulties when they go wrong. We don't need to bury our heads in the sand and regress back to this unconscious heaven of our childhoods, because it was just a myth anyway. It wasn't even heaven at all. We just didn't realize the hellish aspects of our vulnerability. It was an unconscious hell, not an unconscious heaven. So we need to have the courage not to make this U-turn back into the past, but instead to embrace and swing on that spiral upwards and integrate the learnings of the journey on the way. That's much healthier and it's much more future focused. Now, I appreciate that is quite a technical lesson in comparison to others in this classroom, but I just wanted to take this zoomed out picture to try to address what's going on in a bigger, more philosophical way and look at the assumptions around nostalgia that underpins all of this. And just to make it really, really explicit, I'm not criticizing or critiquing Christian-specific stories or the religion, but it's rather the romantic view of the past which takes its inspiration from those stories quite a lot of the time. Now, Ken Wilber is fantastic at wording these problems and giving solutions far, far better than I am. So I would recommend reading the essential Ken Wilber if you wanted just some short summaries of his problems and his solutions. And he's written quite a lot of books. So you could, from here, then go on to read other books that go into more detail on the specific issues that you like. If you liked this particular idea, then it's what's referred to as the romantic view, and it's explored in pretty massive detail in The Eye of the Spirit as well. So there's two little book recommendations for you, and I'm going to leave it there because that is already quite a heavy, technical, and precise lesson. So I'm going to leave that one there. Right, I'm going to see you in a future lesson, and you might need to watch that one a couple of times just to understand the bigger philosophical picture that I'm trying to paint with all this. But Ken Wilber goes into massive detail on this, like I say, so I do highly recommend looking at what he says about it all. Right, see you in a future lesson. See you then.